It was an October morning, the kind where the sun rises but forgets to bring warmth. The thin chill lingered between the stone steps of the federal courthouse. A black woman stepped out of a silver sedan. Her navy blue blazer fit perfectly. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back, every strand in place. In one hand, she held a dark brown leather file bag. With the other, she adjusted her collar, a ritual quiet and practiced. She didn't look around. She didn't need guidance. Each step tapped gently against the concrete like quiet knocks on the surface of invisible authority. She wore no judge's robe, never had. She believed authority should be felt in how one lived, not in what they wore. But she was wrong. Or at least that morning proved that some people decide who deserves respect based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the pace of their walk. As she neared the security gate, the crowd was still light. A few young attorneys rushed past. A few office workers. She walked slowly, deliberately. That was when a large man stepped in front of her. Black gloves. Cold eyes. His voice was short and sharp. "Step aside, ma'am." She stopped. No frown, no protest. Just a calm question, her voice steady and clear. "Is there a problem?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned from her silver hair to her polished black shoes, then rested on the barely visible badge at her chest. To him, a black woman walking into a federal courthouse alone with no escort, no introduction, could only mean one thing: someone to be checked. No nameplate, no assistant, no one announcing who she was. That was all he needed. He held out his hand, not to assist, to take. She handed over the badge without hesitation. The federal credential caught the light under the ceiling lamp. It needed no explanation, but he barely glanced at it before slipping it into his pocket like it was an expired library card. "I'll need that back." Her voice was firm low. No trace of fear. He stepped in, close, too close. "Why the rush, lady? You late for something important." Each word cut through the thin fabric of basic decency like scissors. A young female guard nearby looked unsure, glanced at them, then turned away. No one stepped in. "I need to get to the hearing." Her voice hadn't changed. He nodded, but not like someone following protocol. It was the nod of a man who believed he was about to teach someone a lesson about their place. "Follow me." Extra screening. No question, no explanation. He grabbed her elbow and led her down a side hallway, his footsteps heavy. The glass doors faded behind them, replaced by a steel door. The secondary screening room, empty, cold. No windows. One chair in the middle. A cart with a scanner. And on it a set of clippers. "I do not consent to being held. There is no legal reason for you to detain me." She spoke without blinking. He stared back, then smiled. Like she'd said something amusing. "That's enough." He pointed at the chair. She didn't move. "That badge you flashed back there means nothing to me." Two more guards entered, one bald pale. The other stood behind her, silent, just enough to pin her arms. "I want your names." "This is a violation of human rights." No one answered. The first man picked up the clippers. "What are you hiding under all that silver hair?" The buzzing broke the air like a swarm of angry bees. One lock fell to the floor, then another, and another. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't shake. She just sat there, back straight, her eyes hollow but unbroken. Strands of hair fell in clusters like fragments of history being ripped from memory. One of the men chuckled. "Looks better this way," the man sneered, her fists clenched, knuckles pale. But her voice, when it came, was calm and terrifyingly certain. "You will regret this." He leaned in close. "People like you always say that." Then, as if completing some meaningless administrative task, he opened the door. "You're free now. Courtroom's down the hall." She rose, slowly. Her hand trembled as she retrieved her badge from the edge of the table. No one handed it to her. No one apologized. No one even said goodbye. She walked out. No rush, no backward glance. But inside her chest, something had been set ablaze. Not rage, not humiliation, something quieter, denser, a silent detonation. The pain wasn't in the blade, not in the insult. It was in the way that entire room believed they had the right to treat her that way. What they didn't know was that in just a few minutes, this silver-haired woman wouldn't be sitting on the defendant's bench. She wouldn't be among the spectators either. She would take her place at the highest seat in the courtroom, the judge's bench. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, steady like a song that didn't need an audience. No one in that courthouse knew what had just happened behind the cold steel door. No one saw her hair fall in chunks. No one saw her eyes stay fixed while her dignity was carved away. And no one knew that the woman they had just humiliated was minutes away from taking the highest seat in that courtroom. But she knew, and she remembered. Every heartbeat in her chest was a silent oath. Ahead stood the double doors of courtroom number 3. A major case was set for hearing. Reporters filled the gallery. Lawyers in dark suits whispered strategies. And in the back rows sat civilians affected by last year's protests, victims, witnesses, voices that had once been silenced. None of them knew that the person presiding over truth today was someone who had just been degraded by the same system they came to face. Protocol said she should enter from her chambers, that she should put on her robe before appearing in public. But today, protocol meant nothing. She stood tall and pushed both doors open wide. The room froze. Not a word was spoken. Every eye turned toward her from the front row attorneys to the press pit. All of them stared at something they couldn't explain. A black woman, her head roughly shaved, walked into the courtroom with terrifying calm. She said nothing, offered no explanation, needed no introduction. She simply walked each step, clicking against the marble floor like a hammer breaking through the shell of corrupted justice. In the corner, standing by the door, was the same guard who had held her by the arm just minutes earlier. His face went pale. His hands shook. His spine locked. He couldn't understand what he was seeing, but she understood, and she didn't look at him. Not a glance, not a frown. She walked to the judge's bench, picked up the folded robe placed neatly on the armrest, and put it on herself. No clerk, no ceremony, no wasted words. She turned and faced her clerk. "Are the files ready?" Her voice was low, slow, sharp like a blade. "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded, then sat down, back straight. Hands folded, no one spoke, not a single cough. The room turned to stone. We begin with file 2413, the case of the federal citizen versus the Charleston Police Department regarding abuse of power and violation of civil rights. Her voice rang out like a bell dropped into the eye of a storm. Every word sharp, clear, no tremor, no break. The attorneys shifted. Some leaned back, some looked down. Others couldn't hide their discomfort. They had seen her before in court on television, but never like this. Never with her head shorn, never with eyes like sharpened steel. Never surrounded by a silence so thick it felt like a verdict waiting to land. A witness took the stand. A middle-aged black man, tired eyes, steady voice. He spoke of his son held down by officers, a knee pressed into his neck until he couldn't breathe. The boy, 17, survived. But he hadn't spoken a full sentence since. She didn't interrupt, didn't speak. She just wrote, slowly, carefully, her eyes locked on the man. But from the far corner of the room, the guard named Riker had started to inch backward as if hoping to vanish into the very space he used to command. He knew, and she knew, the moment of truth was drawing near. After the second witness, she signaled for a recess. People began to rise. Whispers filled the air like leaves before a storm, but she didn't move. Her hands remained still, her eyes fixed ahead. Only when the room had mostly emptied, when only the clerk, a few staff members, and Riker remained, did she speak. Mr. Riker. Her voice was light as air, but it sliced like a razor. He froze, stepped forward. He did hesitant, like walking barefoot over broken glass. State your full name, he stammered. I, Riker. Hank Riker. She leaned slightly. In your 14 years working at this courthouse, how many women have you done this to? His face drained of color. No answer. Give me a number. I don't know. She nodded. I do. 12 complaints. Each word landed like a slap. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just... And that's the problem, isn't it, mister? Riker. Her voice didn't rise, but it cracked everything in the room. You didn't ask my name. You didn't care who I was. You looked at my skin and decided you had the right to shame me. The room went still. Then she rose. For assaulting a federal judge inside her own courthouse, you are now under criminal investigation. She turned to the two guards by the door. Escort Mr. Riker out. Keep him separate from general detainees. Charges will follow. The click of handcuffs echoed like a final verdict. No, wait, I didn't mean to. I didn't know. But she knew. And this time no one spoke up for him. No voices tried to stop it. Riker was led away, hands bound, in front of the very people he used to command. And in that moment, the scales of justice trembled, not from screams, but from a silence that dropped heavy like stone into the heart of a deep river. When the courtroom door closed behind Riker, the sound echoed like a verdict no one needed to explain. The man who once guarded the gate of power had been pushed out in shackles, while the woman he silenced with a razor now sat steady atop the seat of justice. But this reversal was never about just one person. It was a reckoning, a wake-up call to a system that had grown too comfortable legalizing its oppression through uniforms and commands. The session resumed 15 minutes later. She said nothing as the staff organized files and the witnesses returned. But her silence wasn't empty. It carried weight. Like the stillness of the sea before a storm arrives, one by one witnesses took the stand. None of them expected that the atmosphere in the room that day would draw out truths they had buried for years. The first was a young woman, an intern at the courthouse. Her voice trembled, eyes downcast. She recounted that early morning moment when she saw Riker pulling a woman into the private screening room. She didn't know who the woman was, but something had felt wrong. She had wanted to speak up, but fear turned her tongue to stone. I saw it, and I stayed silent. But I don't want to be that person anymore. She looked at the young woman. No judgment, no pity, just a nod. As if to say courage often begins with the simplest act of finally speaking what's right after too many silences. The girl stepped down. Next came a middle-aged worker. He hadn't suffered directly at Riker's hands, but his son had. A 17-year-old pinned to the pavement during a protest. His trachea crushed. He survived but could no longer speak. The father recalled begging for medical help only to be denied. He spoke of the insults hurled at his son even when the boy could no longer defend himself. The room held its breath. Some reached for tissues, some looked down, but no one left. Because in that moment, the pain no longer belonged to just one father. It became a collective memory that had been buried too long. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question. She simply thanked him. Her voice no longer that of a judge. It was the voice of someone who understood what it meant to be dismissed by the very place meant to protect you. After his testimony, silence blanketed the room. But this time, it wasn't followed by retreat. Instead, a man stood from the audience. An older man, gray-haired, holding his soft hat tightly in both hands. He stepped into the center of the room without waiting to be called. His voice was rough. Riker arrested me back in 2011 just because I raised my voice when my daughter was denied a public defender. He slammed me into a wall, broke 2 ribs. I filed a complaint. They said I slipped. He didn't cry, but the air in the room felt crushed. She stood. Is there anyone else? At first, silence. Then one hand went up. Then 3. Then 10. Black men. Elderly women. Young men once frisked without reason. Each had a story, and all had something in common. They had once been silenced by fear, buried beneath legal indifference. No one shouted, no one raged. Just voice after voice, slow and steady like hammer strikes on a door that had been sealed too long. She didn't stop them, she let them speak. Each story a shard of truth once discarded by the system. And now they were fitting back together. Piece by piece, forming a portrait no one could deny, a living indictment. At that moment, she was no longer just a judge. She became the anchor for voices being reborn, the witness to truth long buried, the reminder of something simple but often forgotten. When people stop fearing, the system loses control of the narrative. Midway through the session, a man walked in. No one paid much attention until he spoke, and the room stilled. I used to work here, internal security. I saw Riker cross the line too many times. I filed reports, then they vanished. When I asked, they said he was the kind of man who knew how to handle difficult people. No one interrupted, no one defended. Because truth by then shone like midday sun. The system had protected the abuser, not the abused, not from ignorance, but because silence had been bought with comfort and fake order. That trial didn't end with a verdict. It ended with a shift, a quake. No one left that room the same. Not even her. As she walked out last, no one clapped. No chants filled the air. But every eye followed her. Because that day she didn't just hold court. She made the system bow its head. The air in the courtroom had changed. Not with shouting or chaos, but with a silence that pressed down like weight. A kind of quiet that made people sit straighter, breathe slower, and measure each nod carefully. Because from the moment voices had risen without warning, everyone understood that power no longer belonged to the badges or titles. It now moved in the eyes of those who had been forgotten. She returned after the recess, the robe still on her shoulders, though by now everyone knew she no longer needed it to command attention. Her authority wasn't stitched into cloth. It came from the way she made those who once scoffed lower their gaze. The same people who once looked down on her now had no right to question her. They were left with only one thing to do: listen. The defense bench sat in silence. Then a man in a pinstripe suit rose. Middle-aged, neatly combed hair, his voice polite, but measured with calculation. Your Honor, we'd like to file a special motion. Given the events this morning, our client questions the objectivity of the proceedings. She didn't let him finish. You mean the part where a federal judge was assaulted inside this very courthouse, and now my continuing to preside makes you question my impartiality? He paused. That is correct, Your Honor. So because I was humiliated, I am no longer fit to serve justice. I only mean that personal emotions may affect judgment. Personal emotions. She repeated the phrase not as a question but a challenge. Then she stood. I was dragged into a private room. Not for misconduct, not for any violation, but for the color of my skin. My hair was cut like I was a criminal. No one asked my name. And the only thing that stopped them was time. She looked him in the eye. Yet here I sit, calm, composed, upholding the law, guiding the proceedings, asking precise questions. No threats, no misuse of power. The man said nothing. Not because he had no argument, but because every word she spoke landed with the weight of undeniable truth. So tell me who exactly is bringing emotion into this courtroom. Is it me who remains silent to protect the integrity of this court? Or is it you who cannot accept that a black judge continues to rule fairly even after being publicly shamed? No rebuttal came. He sat down, slowly, heavily. The hearing resumed, but this time the silence among the attorneys no longer felt strategic. It felt like the unraveling of a system that had just been flipped upside down. Those who once recited statutes with confidence now stumbled over truths that no longer lived in the letter of the law. The next person to take the stand wasn't a victim. She was a former court employee, an elderly woman, petite, short hair, glasses perched low. She sat down with steady hands. She didn't need courage from others. I served as head of records here for 8 years. I know exactly how complaint procedures work, and I know that many of those complaints were not handled properly. How many were ignored? At least 12 formal complaints, and over 20 informal ones that were set aside. Who made that decision? She hesitated, then said the name, Judge Mahoney. The name hit the courtroom like a church bell dropped during prayer. Mahoney, who had retired 6 months ago, was once praised as a pillar of integrity. He was also the man who had mentored Celeste into the federal court system. She didn't flinch, no visible reaction, no shock, no sorrow. But her hand on the desk tightened. He said that if those complaints came to light, public trust in the system would collapse. Trust is not maintained by hiding the truth. She said it softly. But everyone heard. And today, we are no longer talking about one man with clippers. We are talking about those who used their position to bury the trail. The woman ended her testimony with a single sentence. I cannot stay silent any longer. Not because I am fearless, but because I have lived too long in fear. The session was adjourned once more, but the air no longer carried the feeling of a courtroom. It felt like a cleansing, a purge not done through violence, but through words, not with indictments, but with truths pulled out from the shadows. And those who once judged were left with only one thing to do: sit still and listen. Afternoon settled in, casting a dull gray light through the courthouse windows, but inside the courtroom nothing hinted that the day was nearing its end. On the contrary, it felt like something was just beginning. The hearing was peeling back layers that time, and indifference had buried deep. After a short recess, she returned to her seat at the bench, her steps even steadier, even though the lights still exposed every patch of skin left bare on her shaven scalp. But no one looked at that with pity anymore. No one dared smirk. They looked at her the way you look at a living symbol, someone bold enough to knock on the gates of a broken system with nothing but bare hands. The clerk leaned in and whispered that an unexpected witness from the judicial department had come forward requesting to speak. She nodded, not surprised. The truth has a strange habit. Once you wake it up, it drags everything buried down with it. The doors opened. A black man stepped in. He walked with a slight, limp salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed. He introduced himself as a retired judicial officer, someone who used to serve in that very building. I worked here for 8 years. I saw Riker. First it was the disrespectful comments, then the unnecessary shoulder grabs, and eventually those private searches with no cause. She didn't interrupt. He kept going. I filed an internal report, sent it through. It disappeared. When I followed up, my supervisor said, "He's the kind of guy who gets the job done, especially with troublemakers." I got the message. People like me were supposed to shut up. The room went still. Everyone, attorneys, reporters, public citizens, sat like they were on thin ice. Not because they feared falling through, but because for the first time they could feel the weight of what they'd always walked over like it was solid ground. I didn't leave this job because of the work. I left because of the silence. Every day I walked into this courthouse, I saw men like Riker get welcomed, and men like me get reminded to stay polite, to represent well. She nodded. Thank you for your courage. His words were like needles stitching up a wound that had been torn wide open for years. Not enough to heal it, but enough to stop it from bleeding in the dark. After his testimony, she returned to her chambers, not to rest, but to face herself. On the desk was a thick folder someone had left behind quietly. No note, just a plain cover with one phrase, internal use only. She opened it. Line after line whipped across her memory like a lash. 12 official complaints, all dismissed. Every rejection signed by the same name, a name she knew well, the same man who once guided her into the federal judiciary, the one who told her this path was righteous. And at the bottom, an excerpt from a personal email. Riker can be tough, but he maintains order, especially with groups that tend to be disruptive. Best to leave it alone. She didn't slam the desk. She didn't sigh. Just laid her hand over the page. Her fingers ran across the crisp cold type. This wasn't about one man's misconduct anymore. This was about a system designed to protect power even when it crushed dignity to do it. There was a knock. Her clerk entered quietly, informing her that the Senate office had sent a request. They wanted her to prepare testimony for a judicial oversight hearing. She smiled. Not because she was pleased, but because at last the ones who built the wall of silence were being forced to pull it apart brick by brick. Later, she stepped back into the courtroom. This time, no one had to be told. Everyone stood. Not for her title, but because no one could find a good enough reason to sit before a woman who had chosen to stand for them. She took her seat. Before we resume argument, I'm entering a document into the official record. This contains all complaints filed against Officer Riker, along with the names of those who signed off on dismissing them. One attorney on the defense side stood ready to object. She raised her hand. Sit down. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was the kind that made disobedience unthinkable. She looked across the courtroom. Every signature in this file wasn't a mistake. It was a choice to ignore victims, a choice to defend the wrong, a choice to keep false order by sacrificing real justice. There was a quiet shuffle at the back. An older man stood. He stepped forward and said he too had been arrested by Riker back in 2011. All because he raised his voice when his daughter was denied fair legal representation. He said he was thrown against a wall, broke a rib. The report said he tripped. I didn't fall. I was thrown. But they told me I fell. So I believed them. She asked, "Did you believe them? Or did you just not have the strength left to fight back?" He didn't answer. But his eyes did. And then one by one, hands rose. Not just a few, dozens. They stood up. They told their stories. No shouting, no pleading, just truth. And in that courtroom, she didn't have to speak. Justice stood on its own in the voices of those once buried under silence. No one cried. No one begged. They just stood like mirrors reflecting a truth long forgotten. And she, once dismissed, once humiliated, now sat steady at the center of the rising wave. The sky above the courthouse turned heavy. Thick clouds, sharp winds, like nature itself, could feel the quiet pressure rising within the gray-white marble walls of justice. But inside, the silence was sharper. Not empty, but the kind of silence that settles when people are forced to confront what they can no longer ignore. When she stepped out of her chambers again, the judge's robe still hung over her shoulders, but she no longer felt it as armor. Whatever power that title once granted had been tested, and all that remained was the person beneath the fabric. She didn't walk out as a judge. She walked out as a woman who had endured humiliation, had her faith in the system stripped bare, and still chose to sit in judgment. No one spoke when she returned to the bench. Every step she took across the cold floor echoed like the knock of an unseen gavel, hammering against falsehood. People didn't just look at her. They followed her with their eyes, as if tracking the rhythm of a ritual they'd never witnessed before. The clerk whispered that a representative from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had arrived with an emergency motion. She didn't flinch, just nodded. This courtroom was no longer about a single case. It had become the epicenter of a reckoning. A man in a gray suit stepped in, introduced himself as a federal representative. He didn't speak long, didn't read from a paper. He stood tall, met her gaze, and gave a slight nod. We're opening an investigation. What happened this morning wasn't misconduct. It was a serious violation of Title 18 of the Civil Rights Act. And it's even more serious because the victim was a federal judge. He paused. We will trace every complaint that was buried, and those who signed off on dismissing them will be held accountable. She responded calmly. Start with the supervisors. Then move to those who chose to look away. He nodded again. But before leaving, he turned and said something that made the entire room hold its breath. This morning's video has already spread across the internet, not just the media. The Senate has seen it too. Some are calling this hearing a turning point in modern justice. She didn't respond, just looked forward, because she knew change wouldn't come from headlines. It would come from how the people in this room chose to carry responsibility. After the federal agent left, she returned to the bench. But this time she removed her robe, folded it neatly, set it aside. No explanation, no ceremony. And yet everyone understood. That was a message. Sometimes to truly deliver justice, you have to set aside the very symbols you once believed gave you power. She stood. I want to make an official statement. The entire room froze. She looked out across both aisles. Starting today, I'm proposing an immediate reform program for all courthouse security and personnel in this jurisdiction. She held up a slim, well-organized document. It's called the Monroe Standard. Her voice was steady. It includes mandatory psychological evaluations, bias recognition training, regular reviews, and a zero-tolerance policy for violations. This is not a promise. This is an order. Someone gasped. Another lowered their head. A few glanced at each other, but no one dared laugh. She didn't care what they thought. She understood one thing. If she didn't do this, no one would. And if someone who had been publicly humiliated could still sit at the seat of justice, then no one had an excuse to remain silent. The clerk stepped forward and placed a list on her desk. Behind him stood an old black pastor, quiet, trembling, his silver hair glowing in the afternoon light. She recognized him, Reverend Marcus. He had guided her through her earliest days in law. The man who once told her the law is a double-edged sword. It either protects hope or kills it. He didn't say much, just handed over the list. Names of those targeted by Riker. Some of them had never been acknowledged. They're willing to speak if you need them. They've waited long enough. She opened the list. Handwritten names. Uneven ink. A few phone numbers. A few brief notes, whispers from the past. She exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but from knowing that this was no longer a trial. It was the excavation of a system built on deliberate forgetting. As she stood resting her hand on the list, the afternoon sun cut through the window behind her, lighting half her face. Anyone who still believed the robe was what defined power, they were wrong. She had been shaved bald in her own courthouse, treated like someone without a name. She had walked those halls with her head held high and nothing left to lose. And in that moment, stripped of all symbols, the truth burned brighter than ever. No applause. No one stood. But every eye in that room knew one thing. Justice had finally stepped out of the shadows. The news spread faster than any subpoena could. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had become more than reporters chasing a headline. It was now a tide of people from every shade and every walk of life. Elderly men with canes, young mothers holding babies, black students with hand-drawn signs scrawled in uneven ink. They didn't need to know the legal language in the case file. All they needed to know was that a woman who had once been humiliated in silence was now forcing a whole system to listen. Inside, Celeste kept her rhythm steady. Every piece of evidence was filed, every testimony recorded. But the hush that filled the room now wasn't about reverence. It was a different kind of silence. One that comes when people sense something larger than the law is about to enter. And then an older woman stepped onto the witness stand. She wasn't on the list. She hadn't been called, but she stood anyway. Her eyes deep brown, her silver curls tightly coiled. Her voice trembled slightly, but each word struck like stone against glass. I worked here 11 years. I saw Riker shove a young boy into a wall. I saw him cut the belongings of a new staff member just because she asked why she was being searched. I filed a report. They called me into administration, said I was disturbing the order. Celeste watched her, didn't interrupt. That kind of testimony didn't need guidance. I was reassigned, then let go. No one stood with me, so I stayed silent. Until today. After her, a middle-aged man stood, then a young woman. Then an elderly man hunched over, clutching a tattered notebook. One by one, they emerged from the gallery like a hidden thread, was tugging at the pain they'd buried for years. They weren't witnesses to a case. They were living proof of a system that chose to look away. A short-haired girl in a faded sweater stepped forward. I interned here. First day Riker told me, if you want to survive this place, learn to keep your mouth shut. I thought it was a joke. On the third day, I saw him drag a black woman into a private room. I stood 2 meters away. I did nothing. And the worst part is, I convinced myself silence was the safest choice. Her voice cracked. But she kept going. I'm here today not because I'm brave, but because you were brave before me. The room stilled again. Celeste said nothing. She let them speak, because she understood that when someone finds the strength to rise, no matter how late, it still matters. A young security guard in a fresh uniform took the stand next. His hand shook, but his eyes didn't flinch. I'm new here. They told me if you see Riker doing something, just ignore it. Don't interfere. I used to think staying quiet was how I protected myself. But now I see it clearly. Staying quiet in the face of wrong isn't protection. It's complicity. Celeste tilted her head slightly. Her nod wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. Truth once spoken didn't need polish. Then, like dominoes falling, hands began to rise. Not one or two, dozens. No one called on them, no one signaled. These were people the system had taught to believe their voices had no worth. Now they were proving otherwise. There was no applause, no cheers. But the air in the courtroom, once heavy with the old power, began to crack. Each story was an axe striking the crust of false order used for too long to excuse abuse. Outside, the crowd thickened. Someone broadcasted a live audio feed from the courtroom. People stood shoulder to shoulder, not to riot, but to witness. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to explode, not in violence, but in truth. Back inside, Celeste finally spoke. She didn't ask a question, didn't challenge a word. She simply said, "I want to thank everyone who stood up." Her voice wasn't loud, but it rang like bronze. Not for me, not for the court, but for yourselves. Because when you speak, this system can no longer pretend it doesn't know. It can no longer deny its wrongs. No one responded. They didn't have to. Because in that moment, silence was confirmation. She turned to the defendant's lawyers, her voice now cold as steel. "You claimed I was no longer objective, that being a victim made me biased." She paused. "But you forgot something. I'm not just a victim. I'm the one holding the gavel. I'm the one conducting justice. And today, justice does not have to be emotionless to be right." Court was adjourned for a recess, but no one moved. They remained in their seats as if afraid that the door just cracked open might slam shut again, as if it had never opened at all. Rain began to fall, not heavy, but steady, as if even the air itself needed cleansing. Outside, the courthouse umbrellas unfolded in silence, but no one left. They stayed, letting the cold drops soak through coats and hair. No one moved because everyone knew this moment couldn't be missed. In the damp stillness of the afternoon, the once voiceless now stood at the heart of a storm they had long been told they weren't part of. Inside, Celeste sat quietly at the long table covered in gray cloth. There were no more thick case files, no lengthy depositions, just a single handwritten sheet. She had chosen to read the final words herself, not from a legal brief, not in court speak, but in the voice of someone who had lost everything and still chose to sit in judgment for thousands of others. When court resumed, all eyes turned to her. But this time, no one was waiting for a verdict. They were waiting for resolve, for a declaration that justice was no longer some abstract promise in a press conference, but something real, something here. Now, she unfolded the paper. Her voice was calm, deliberate. Within the next 48 hours, all federal courthouse security personnel under District 3 will be temporarily suspended to undergo full reevaluation of ethical conduct and bias assessment. She looked up, eyes locking onto the faces across the aisle. "Starting with you," she set eyes on one official, then turned, "And you. And every one of you who sat here for a decade and never asked why so many complaints disappeared. 3 strikes of the gavel, sharp, final, not to end something, but to begin. I hereby request the Department of Justice expand its investigation not just into the actions of one man named Riker, but into how an entire system ignored, enabled, and institutionalized abuse under the guise of policy." There was murmuring from the press benches, but no one dared interrupt. I am also issuing mandatory subpoenas to all officials who signed off on dismissing complaints related to racial discrimination over the past 10 years. Those who thought ink on paper could erase truth will now be required to answer for it. Her voice was not loud, but in that room it cut deeper than any microphone could, because every word carried the weight of the silenced. The air thickened as if everyone held their breath to absorb every syllable. A young reporter, hair messy, eyes lit slowly, raised a camera. No need to frame the shot. Just capture the face of a woman who showed her wounds, didn't flinch, and never apologized for speaking. I wasn't shaved bald because I broke a rule, she said, but because the system didn't know what to do with someone like me, a black woman, a federal judge. And not willing to stay quiet, some bowed their heads, some cried, but not her. And if anyone thought that would make me quit, they should know it did the opposite. It made me see clearer than ever that this seat isn't here to represent power. It's here to protect those who have none. In that moment, no one in the courtroom could deny justice was happening right before them. Not through verdicts, but through commitment. Not in documents, but in deeds. Celeste rose and stepped away from the bench. Quietly, no applause followed. But the entire courtroom stood with her, not by protocol, but by instinct. As if their very bodies understood this was the only way to not be complicit in the silence that came before. Outside, the rain had stopped. Puddles on the courthouse steps mirrored the image of a woman walking out alone. No bodyguards, no entourage, just her, bold, unflinching. But behind her, footsteps began to follow, quiet at first, then more. Those who had once thought their voices too small were now learning to speak, not to scream, but to never again be silent. And she, Celeste Monroe, didn't need a robe to prove who carried justice, because today truth stood up on its own. 3 days after the hearing, no one called it a trial anymore. The media gave it a new name, the silence break. The image of Celeste Monroe walking out of the courthouse, bald-headed, holding nothing but a single piece of paper, flooded the headlines. But what shook people more than that image was the ripple effect that came afterward. From neighboring states, letters started pouring in. Videos, complaint files. Victims who had long stayed silent began speaking out. Cases once buried. Evidence once destroyed. All suddenly resurfacing. In less than 72 hours, the Office of the Federal Prosecutor received over 400 petitions requesting new investigations into alleged misconduct by court security officers. Celeste said nothing. No interviews, no press briefings, no media statements. Because she knew one truth. If justice wanted to be trusted again, it had to show up in action, not just words. On the fourth morning, she returned to her office. No cameras, no crowds, just the familiar gray walls and the soft rustle of paperwork. Her young clerk stepped in and placed a brown envelope on her desk, sent from the highest office in Washington. Inside was an official memo from the Department of Justice. Celeste Monroe was appointed to the Federal Judiciary Reform Oversight Board with full authority to review hiring procedures and security operations in all federal courthouses. She read it silently, no smile, no surprise. Then folded the letter and set it aside. Power didn't change her. Power was just a tool. The real goal was change. Real measurable change. That afternoon, she was invited to speak with a group of young law students from Columbia. They didn't want to hear about the Riker case. They wanted to understand how she kept walking when everything around her had collapsed. She entered a small classroom. No podium, no leather chairs. Just worn wooden desks and the focused eyes of a few dozen students, most of them students of color. One student stood up, his voice slightly trembling. I used to believe there was no space for someone like me in this system. That survival meant keeping my head down. But when I saw you walk out of that courthouse, I felt ashamed. Ashamed of how long I stayed silent. Celeste didn't lecture. She told them her story. About that morning, about the scissors cutting through her hair, the cold bite of isolation, and why she chose to return to that courtroom seat instead of walking away and letting it all end. Because if I walked away, she said, I'd just become another name on the long list of people who tried but didn't last long enough. And the system would breathe a sigh of relief. Someone asked her if she had been afraid. Of course I was, she said. But what scared me more was raising my daughter in a world where justice is a luxury only for the lucky. Silence spread across the room, but it wasn't fear, it was resolve. The very next day, 3 members of the Judicial Oversight Board submitted their resignations. One of them had once signed off on the first dismissal of a complaint against Riker. When asked by the press why he stepped down, he said, "Some things can't be hidden forever. I'm just the first to take responsibility." Celeste read that headline while standing in her kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. No cameras, no applause. But she knew these were the consequences of a ripple started by the quietest voice. That night, she stepped out onto her front porch and looked down the quiet street. The moon was bright enough to cast her shadow on the ground. And that's when she realized she wasn't walking alone anymore. Somewhere out there, people were standing up. From different cities, from different courts. They were beginning to walk in the same direction, not for her, but for a principle. That truth must never be forgotten, and justice must never be silent. 3 months after that pivotal trial, no one mentioned the name Riker as a threat anymore. The headlines that once screamed outrage had been replaced by in-depth analysis, interviews, and reform reports. But Celeste didn't pay much attention to any of it. She never started this for fame. To her, notoriety was just another form of noise, and in the noise, people too easily forget the most important thing of all those who've been forgotten. On Monday morning, she returned to the headquarters of the Federal Judicial Reform Task Force. There were no flowers waiting, no banners. Just thick folders, closed-door meetings, and numbers that spoke louder than applause. She began her day like anyone else at her desk, reading every line of the reports pouring in from across the country. Reports detailing buried cases, investigations cut short, and officials quietly bringing evidence into the light. Beneath each report, she insisted one thing be added: the names of the victims, not for formality, but because of one unshakable principle: no one should ever be reduced to a number. Every name is a person. Every person a story. And if justice is to mean anything at all, it must first remember their names, those who were once denied even the right to be heard. That afternoon, she visited a small district court in Georgia, a place where 5 different complaints had been dismissed for lack of evidence. But this time, she didn't come as an inspector. She came to meet the families who had once written petitions into the void. In a worn-down meeting room with chipped brick walls and wobbly chairs, nearly 20 people gathered around her. A middle-aged man held a photo of his son. The boy had been detained for over 8 hours just for failing to present an ID. When the family pushed back, he was moved to a holding facility and never returned. I filed complaints, the man said, 4 times. They said no evidence, said the cameras were broken, said I should move on. But how do you forget your own child, Celeste, didn't respond right away? She met his eyes. No empty promises, no rehearsed lines. I can't bring your son back, she said quietly, but I can return to you the one thing the system stole recognition. That your son was wronged. The father's hands trembled, not from emotion, but because for the first time he knew he wasn't speaking into silence. A young woman, her voice cracked and uncertain, asked if the changes were real or if everything would soon fade away again. Celeste looked her in the eyes, her voice steady as steel. What was once shoved into the dark may return there, but what thousands have stood up to speak out loud that will never die. The next day, Celeste received a handwritten letter, sent from an elderly woman living in Mississippi. She had filed a complaint against Riker in 2009. She never heard back. In the letter she wrote, I once believed I'd die before anyone believed me, but today I saw you, and now I know I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I was just born too early in a system that wasn't ready to hear the truth. Celeste kept that letter in her drawer, not framed, not displayed, but every morning before she began work, she'd take it out and read it, line by line. A reminder that this fight didn't begin with her. It began with those who had no voice. Late at night, returning home, she walked through her quiet neighborhood. The neighbors no longer avoided her gaze. Streetlights flickered a pale yellow. The wind whispered through the trees. But her heart was calm, not because she'd won, but because she had kept the one promise that mattered most, the promise to herself, that she would never become part of the silence that had swallowed generations. On her desk, amidst the piles of paperwork and scheduled calls, sat a tiny slip of paper scribbled in pencil. Justice, when it's no longer just a symbol, finally becomes real. Celeste smiled. Not a big smile, but a true one. And in that moment, she knew you don't need a grand courtroom or a stirring speech to change the world. You only need enough people willing to stand, enough people who won't accept silence, and one person brave enough to begin.